He walked into a room full of billionaires carrying a plain envelope, and within 60 seconds, he saw exactly how 3 people in that room were planning to destroy the most powerful woman in the building. Nobody noticed him. They never do. He wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't look the part, didn't dress the part, and when security grabbed his arm and told him to leave, he didn't argue. He just said quietly, "Someone in this hotel is going to take everything from Vivienne Harrow tonight, and you just used up 30 seconds we didn't have. If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss what's coming next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The Sterling Crown Hotel had been built to make people feel small. That was the point of it, the 40-foot ceilings, the imported marble that caught the light and threw it back in your face, the chandeliers that hung low enough to admire, but high enough to remind you they weren't yours. The architects had designed it as a monument to a certain kind of power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because the building did it for them. Walking through the front doors for the first time, most people instinctively straightened their posture. They adjusted their jackets. They moved a little more carefully, spoke a little more quietly, because the room itself seemed to demand it. Gavin Mercer walked through those same doors at 7:43 on a Thursday evening and did none of those things. He came in off the street with a plain white envelope tucked under one arm and a work jacket that had seen better years. His boots were steel-toed and scuffed across the toe caps, in the way that happens when you've been wearing the same pair for too long and haven't bothered to replace them. He was 37 years old and looked it not in a soft way, but in the way of someone who had spent a significant portion of his life outdoors in conditions that weren't particularly forgiving. There was a small scar along his jaw that he'd stopped noticing years ago. His hair needed cutting. He hadn't shaved since Tuesday. He stepped into the lobby and stopped. Not because he was overwhelmed by the grandeur, he wasn't. He stopped because stopping was the first thing you did in an unfamiliar environment. You stopped, and you looked, and you figured out what was wrong before you moved. Something was wrong. He couldn't have told you in that first moment exactly what it was. It was more like a shift in temperature that you feel before you understand it, a pressure in the air that registers before your brain catches up with your instincts. He stood just inside the entrance while guests in evening wear moved around him like a stream parting around a stone, and he let his eyes work. The lobby was organized chaos. Staff in dark uniforms moved efficiently between the check-in desk and a bank of elevators to his left. 2 men in suits stood near the entrance to the ballroom corridor security. He cataloged legitimate, relaxed posture, earpieces with short cords. Guests clustered in small groups near the champagne station, the kind of low laughter and careful touching that happened when people were networking and pretending they weren't. Then he found the first one, a man in a hotel uniform near the base of the north staircase, standing with his back to the wall and both hands visible at his sides. Hotel staff didn't stand like that. Hotel staff were always moving, always carrying something, always in transit between one task and another. This man was completely still, and he was positioned with a clear sightline to the main elevator bank and the lobby entrance simultaneously. Positioning. Gavin moved his gaze without moving his head and picked up the second one inside of 20 seconds. A woman near the coat check, same stillness, same deliberate placement, angled so she could see the corridor that led toward the service areas behind the kitchen. He was looking for the third when a hand came down on his shoulder. "Sir." The voice was flat and professionally courteous in the way that meant the courtesy was optional. "Can I help you with something?" The security guard was young, maybe 26, and built with the kind of gym muscle that looked impressive, but wasn't the same as the other kind. His name badge said Marcus. He was already looking Gavin up and down with the particular expression that people wore when they'd already made a decision and were just going through the courtesy of confirming it. "I'm here to deliver something," Gavin said. He kept his voice even. "I need to speak to whoever's handling security for the Harrow event. Deliveries go through the service entrance on Covington Street." Marcus was already angling his body to redirect Gavin back toward the door. "I'll need you to, I understand." Gavin didn't move. "This isn't that kind of delivery. I need to speak to your security director." "Sir, I've been in this lobby for about 90 seconds, Gavin said quietly, "and I've already spotted 2 people in your uniforms who are not your employees. I'm guessing there's a third one somewhere near the service corridor that runs behind the kitchen." If I'm wrong, you can walk me out and I'll apologize. But if I'm right, you need to get me in front of someone who can actually do something about it before 700 guests sit down to dinner. Marcus looked at him. There was a moment, brief but real, where the professionalism slipped, and something genuinely uncertain moved across his face. "Wait here," he said. It took 11 minutes. Gavin spent them standing in the same spot, not because anyone told him to stay, but because moving around a lobby when you weren't supposed to be there was how you got yourself removed. He used the time to keep working the room. The third imposter was where he'd suspected near the service entrance, half concealed by a large floral arrangement that someone had placed there to look decorative and had conveniently created a standing position with partial cover. He also found the cameras. 3 of the Sterling Crown's lobby cameras had been subtly adjusted, tilted just a few degrees off their original mounting angles. Not enough to trigger an alert in a monitor room where someone was watching 30 feeds at once, but enough to create a combined blind spot covering the main staircase and the corridor that ran toward the ballroom's secondary entrance. You'd only notice if you knew what the original camera positions were supposed to be, or if you were standing in the right spot and happened to look up at exactly the right angle. Gavin had been trained to notice exactly that kind of thing. He'd spent 11 years noticing exactly that kind of thing, in places considerably less comfortable than a hotel lobby. When Marcus returned, he had a woman with him. She was late 30s, compact, wearing a dark blazer over a plain shirt, with the kind of watchful stillness that told Gavin she'd been doing this kind of work long enough that she didn't have to advertise it. "Naomi Calder," she said. She didn't extend her hand. "I'm the deputy security coordinator for the evening. Tell me what you saw." 3 individuals in hotel uniforms. Not staff. Tactical positioning north staircase, coat check, and behind the floral arrangement near the service exit. Your northwest camera cluster has been adjusted. Probably recently, within the last 6 hours. Because whoever did it was good but not perfect. You can see the edge of the original mount shadow if you look from the right angle. Naomi was very still. "And you are Gavin Mercer." He held out the envelope. "This was left for me 6 days ago by a man named Owen Voss. He asked me to bring it here tonight specifically, to this event, and to put it directly in front of Vivienne Harrow. He was very specific about that. Owen Voss." Something changed in her expression, carefully controlled, but it changed. "Owen Voss has been missing for 6 weeks. "I know. How do you know Owen Voss?" "We served together," Gavin said. "A long time ago. Different branches, one joint deployment. He reached out to me 8 weeks back saying he was into something complicated and might need someone he could trust. 6 days ago, that envelope showed up at my house with a note saying to bring it here tonight and not to call anyone until I did." Naomi looked at the envelope, then back at him. "What's in it?" "I don't know. I didn't open it." That seemed to surprise her. "Why not?" "Because Owen asked me not to," he said it simply. He said the information inside was specifically for Vivienne Harrow, and that if anything happened to him, she needed to see it exactly as he'd packaged it. Chain of evidence. He was thorough about things like that. Naomi studied him for another few seconds, measuring something she didn't say out loud. Then she said, "What did you do before whatever you're doing now?" "Navy," said SEAL teams. 11 years. "And now?" "I fix things," he said. "Houses, mostly. It pays okay, and I'm home by 5. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. "Come with me." Corridor behind the main ballroom was a different world from the lobby utilitarian, fluorescent lit, smelling of industrial cleaner and the particular warmth of commercial kitchen equipment running at full capacity. Staff moved through it with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to get out of each other's way. Naomi led Gavin through it quickly, past stacked linen carts and a catering manager gesturing at a clipboard, toward a door at the far end marked Private Event Coordination. She stopped before opening it. "Vivienne Harrow is managing 300 guests right now, and this gala is not incidental," she said. "The North Haven announcement represents years of work and several $1 billion in committed investment. She cannot simply cancel the evening." "I'm not going to tell her to cancel it," Gavin said. Naomi looked at him. "What are you going to tell her?" "The truth. And then I'm going to let her decide what to do with it." Vivienne Harrow was 30 years old and had the particular quality of certain people who'd been working very hard for a very long time, a kind of focused energy that never fully went off, like a furnace that stayed at operating temperature even between burns. She was in a dark evening dress that cost more than Gavin's truck, standing over a table covered in seating charts, logistics sheets, and a printed guest list with handwritten notes in the margins. She looked up when Naomi brought him in. Her eyes moved over him in a single, quick past the jacket, the boots, the envelope, his face, and she said, "You're not hotel staff." "No, Naomi," she said. Without looking away from Gavin, closed the door. She listened to him without interrupting. Gavin appreciated that. Some people, when they were nervous or in control or both, couldn't stop themselves from jumping in, clarifying, questioning, redirecting. Vivienne Harrow sat on the edge of the table with her arms crossed and listened to everything he had to say. And when he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Owen is alive, as of 6 days ago, yes." "You're sure?" "The note was handwritten. I know his handwriting. He's hiding, which isn't the same as being okay, but he's alive." She looked at the envelope in his hands. He gave it to her, and she opened it carefully and read what was inside. He watched her face while she did it, not because he was trying to read her. She wasn't the kind of person whose face gave things away easily, but because he wanted to see how she handled what the letter said. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table. "Someone inside my security organization," she said. It wasn't quite a question. That's what Owen's evidence suggests. Spent 6 weeks building the documentation. And tonight is the... Yes. She was quiet again. Then she stood up and walked to the window that looked out through one-way glass into the corridor beyond, and she stood there for a moment with her back to him. Gavin could see a muscle working in her jaw. "If I cancel the gala," she said, "they know we know." "Yes." And they disappear. Regroup. Come at the project from a different angle 6 months from now, with better preparation. Probably, she turned around. "So we don't cancel. That's my recommendation. But it's your event and your decision." "What would you do?" She said it directly, looking at him straight. It wasn't a rhetorical question. "I'd keep them exactly where they are," Gavin said. "Right now, they think they have the advantage. They've done their preparation. They have their people in position. They think tonight is going their way." He paused. "The moment they believe that is the moment they stop adapting. And people who stop adapting make mistakes." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Naomi told me you identified 3 of them. 3 visible ones. There are more. How many more?" "I don't know yet." He said it honestly, because there was no point in anything else. "That's what I'd like to find out." What they found, over the next 40 minutes, was considerably worse than 3 imposters. Naomi had access to the hotel's full security infrastructure through the event coordination contract, and she and Gavin worked through it methodically while Vivienne returned to her guests and kept the evening moving exactly as planned. The camera adjustment in the lobby was only the beginning. 14 cameras across the hotel had been subtly redirected. 6 of them had been looped the feeds, replacing live footage with recorded footage from earlier in the day, a quiet, professional touch that suggested whoever had done this had done it before. The emergency communication lines for the ballroom's dedicated security channel had been cut at a junction box in the basement utility corridor, not destroyed, just disconnected, cleanly and precisely, leaving everything looking intact at a glance. 3 sections of the hotel had been effectively removed from normal surveillance entirely, creating a continuous path from the ballroom's secondary entrance through the service corridors to the underground loading area. "This took weeks," Naomi said. She was sitting in front of a monitoring screen with the look of someone who was very carefully not showing how angry she was. "You don't do this kind of infrastructure work in a day." They had inside access, not just access, Gavin said. He was looking at the map of the blind spot corridor on her screen. They needed someone who knew the security layout well enough to know which cameras mattered and which ones could be left alone. Someone who had the authority to arrange service crew access without generating flags. Naomi was quiet. Gavin looked at her. "You know who," he said. "I have a suspicion," she said carefully. "I don't have evidence." "Warren Slade." She looked at him. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it either. "Tell me about him," Gavin said. She told him. 9 years with Vivienne's organization. Built the entire security infrastructure from a 3-person operation into a full department. Trusted completely. The kind of loyalty that looked, from the outside, like the real thing. "Does Vivienne know you suspect him?" "Vivienne trusts Warren," Naomi said. Came out tired. She's known him since she was 21 years old. Gavin didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. Trust built over 9 years was a harder thing to dismantle than a camera system, and it should be the problem was when someone deliberately used it as a tool. He was working through the schematics of the service corridor when he heard the voices. The maintenance access panel between the event coordination room and the adjacent service area had a gap at the bottom, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary settling of an old building, creating a quarter-inch of imperfect seal. Enough in a quiet moment to carry sound. 2 voices. Male, keeping it low. Gavin held up a hand to stop Naomi from moving and went very still. Timing stays the same. Dinner, 2nd course. She'll step away from the table and we intercept in the corridor before she gets to thee. Slade confirmed the documents are ready. He confirmed. She signs, we're done. They run the wire transfer in the morning, and by the time anyone realizes the signature was obtained under. The voices moved away, deeper into the service area, and he lost the rest. He and Naomi looked at each other. They're not here for the keynote, she said quietly. No, Gavin said. They're not here for Vivienne's speech at all. He looked at the corridor schematic on the screen. The blind spot path from the secondary ballroom entrance to the loading area. Cut communication lines. The positioned imposters. The gala is cover. The goal is to get her alone, get something signed, and make it look like it happened voluntarily. The North Haven transfer documents, Naomi said. Her voice had gone flat. They want control of the development project. They want the signature, Gavin said. And they've spent months making sure they can get it and get out clean. He thought about Vivienne Harrow at that table, managing 300 people with handwritten notes in her margins, 9 years of work accumulated in the files she'd carried to that room. We need to tell her, he said, and then we need to be in position before the 2nd course. Naomi was already reaching for her radio. Then she stopped. If Warren is monitoring security communications, he is, Gavin said. Don't use it, she put the radio back. Looked at him. Then how do we do it the old way, Gavin said. We go tell her in person, and after that, we figure out what they think is going to happen, and we make sure something different happens instead. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd put it, and for a moment he thought about Sophie at home, 8 years old and sleeping under a blanket with small yellow stars, completely unaware that her father was standing in a hotel corridor at 9:30 at night, getting ready to walk into something complicated. He thought about that for exactly as long as he allowed himself to think about it. Then he followed Naomi back toward the noise of the ballroom. The ballroom was exactly what it was supposed to be: beautiful, controlled, and completely unaware of what was moving through the walls around it. 300 people in evening wear occupied round tables, draped in white linen, and the noise of it was the comfortable kind, the layered sound of people who were pleased to be seen in the same room as each other. Champagne moved on trays. Someone near the stage was testing a microphone with the kind of quiet professionalism that was supposed to be invisible. Vivienne Harrow stood near the center of the room in conversation with 2 men Gavin didn't recognize older. The kind of careful posture that came with serious money, and the patience it took to hold on to it, and she was listening to one of them with an expression that looked entirely present and gave nothing away about the conversation. She'd had 20 minutes ago in the coordination room. Gavin had to admit she was good at that. He and Naomi came in through the service entrance at the room's far edge and found a position near the wall where they could see the full layout without being obvious about it. The 3 imposters in hotel uniforms were still in their positions. Gavin tracked each one from where he stood north staircase, coat check, and the service corridor entrance, and noted that none of them had moved. Whatever their timeline was, it hadn't started yet. 2nd course, Naomi said quietly beside him. She was watching the room the same way he was, though she was doing it while appearing to check something on a small tablet. That gives us maybe 40 minutes less, Gavin said. 1st course was already being plated when we came through the kitchen. She didn't respond to that immediately. Gavin watched the room. One of the men Vivienne was speaking with said something that made her laugh, real laughter, not the performed kind, and then she excused herself smoothly and began moving toward the head table in a way that looked like natural circulation and was almost certainly her working toward a position where Naomi could reach her without being obvious. She's good, Gavin said. She's been handling rooms like this since she was 24, Naomi said. You get good at it or you don't last. Vivienne reached the head table and stopped to speak with a woman seated there. While she was doing it, she angled her body slightly towards the wall, where Naomi and Gavin were standing a small deliberate shift that would have looked like nothing to anyone watching, and Naomi moved. Took less than 2 minutes. Naomi reached Vivienne's side, appeared to deliver a quiet logistical note, and Vivienne nodded twice. asked the woman at the table, a question that gave her something to think about for 30 seconds, and then walked with Naomi toward the corridor near the service entrance. Gavin met them there. Vivienne's face when she came through the door was a different thing from the face she'd been wearing in the ballroom. Not panicked, she wasn't the kind of person who panicked easily. Or at least she'd trained herself out of showing it, but tighter. More present. "Tell me," she said. Gavin told her what he and Naomi had heard through the access panel. He kept it short and factual because she didn't need it decorated, and she listened the same way she had before completely. Without interruption, her arms crossed and her chin slightly down. When he finished, she was quiet for a count of about 5 seconds. "They want the transfer document signed," she said. "Yes, during dinner. Second course. They plan to intercept you in the corridor between the ballroom and the private dining area. Primary blind spot in the camera network. How many of them? Minimum of 5 that we can account for. 3 positioned in the lobby and ground floor. 2 in the service areas based on the conversation we overheard. There may be more." She looked at him, "And Warren is coordinating them." It wasn't exactly a question. Gavin watched her face when she said it, and there was something there that was harder to read than the professional composure, something older and more personal, something that had been sitting with her since he'd first mentioned the internal source, working its way forward. "The evidence suggests," Gavin said. He wasn't going to soften it for her. Vivienne looked away. She looked at a point on the wall for a moment and then looked back. "Warren built this security department," she said. "He was the one who first told me I needed dedicated personnel instead of contracting everything out. He wrote the protocols we've been running for 6 years. "I know," Gavin said, "which means he knows every weakness in those protocols." "Yes, and he's been using them." Gavin didn't answer that one. She already knew the answer. She uncrossed her arms, then crossed them again. A small involuntary thing. "What do you need from me?" "Keep the evening exactly on schedule," Gavin said. "You go in for dinner, you take your seat, you do the first course exactly as planned. If they see any deviation from the script they're expecting, they'll abort and we lose them. Everything has to look exactly like the gala they've been preparing for. And when they move on me during the second course, you don't go to the corridor. If I don't go to the corridor, they know something's wrong. Which is why I'll be in the corridor before you are," Gavin said. "You won't be walking into an ambush. You'll be walking into a position where we've already removed the threat." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "You're one person. I've handled worse with less," he said. It came out more direct than he intended it to, but it was true, and she seemed to recognize that it was true because she didn't push back on it. "What about Warren?" Naomi said. She'd been quiet through most of this, watching both of them. "He'll be monitoring from somewhere. If he sees anything off." "Where does he usually position himself during events?" Gavin asked. "Security monitoring suite on the second floor," Naomi said. "He has access to all the active camera feeds from there." "Active camera feeds," Gavin said, meaning the ones that are still live, not the ones that have been looped. Naomi caught it. "He's not watching the areas, he's already blinded." "Can't monitor what he's already removed from the system," Gavin said. "Which means the service corridor, the loading area access, and the section behind the north staircase are all off his screen right now. He set up his own blind spots." He paused. "We use those." Vivienne had been listening to this with an expression that was moving through something complicated, the specific looks of someone who was processing a version of betrayal they'd been half expecting, but hadn't quite believed would actually arrive. Pressed her fingers briefly against her collarbone, a small, unconscious gesture, and then dropped her hand. "All right," she said. "What do you need me to do exactly?" The next 35 minutes were the kind of controlled tension that looked like nothing from the outside. Vivienne went back into the ballroom and took her seat at the head table and smiled at the man on her left who was telling on her left. A 6-story that had apparently run aground somewhere off the coast of Portugal. She listened with apparent interest. She ate the first course, a chilled seafood presentation that she barely tasted, and she laughed at the appropriate moments and asked questions that showed she'd been paying attention. 300 people in that room saw a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be. Gavin saw a woman doing the hardest thing that situation required, which was pretending everything was fine when she knew exactly what was coming. He spent those 35 minutes in the service corridor with Naomi, working through what they had. The corridor ran behind the ballroom's east wall, a narrow, utilitarian space used for catering, equipment transit, and staff movement during events, with a branch at the midpoint that turned north toward the hotel's private dining facilities. It was the natural route that Vivienne would take if she stepped out from the ballroom during dinner, and it had been carefully stripped of any surveillance that might record what happened to her there. The original lights had been supplemented with low-level emergency strip lighting along the base of the walls, which gave the space a flat, uncharitable quality that made the equipment carts and stacked crates along the walls look like obstacles in an industrial basement. There were two access points that Gavin was concerned about. The service entrance from the kitchen corridor, which was where the imposter near the coat check would most likely come from, and the maintenance access at the northern branch, which connected to the elevator shaft housing and gave anyone stationed there a position directly in Vivienne's path before she reached the private dining area. They're using the maintenance access, Naomi said. They need a key card. Those are logged. Not anymore, Gavin said. He was looking at the panel on the access door. Someone had run a thin loop of conductive tape around the card reader's contact points, subtle enough to miss in a quick check, effective enough to prevent the reader from recording a valid transaction. They disabled the logging. Probably 2 days ago, when they had someone do the camera work. Naomi looked at it. So we don't know who's been through here. We know someone has. He examined the tape. This is careful work. Whoever did the physical preparation knew exactly what they were doing. Which brings us back to Warren, he agreed. He straightened up and looked down the length of the corridor. There was a section about 20 feet from the north branch where a series of industrial shelving units had been positioned along the east wall part of the hotel's standard event storage arrangement, loaded with folded table linens, spare chair covers, extra centerpiece components. They created a natural alcove on the west side of the corridor, deep enough to conceal a person entirely from anyone approaching from the ballroom end. Gavin stood in the alcove and looked out. Clear sightline to the north branch. Clear sightline to the kitchen corridor entrance. And from the outside, approaching from either direction, the space looked like nothing more than a gap between shelving units. Here, he said. Naomi looked at the space. She looked at him. You're not trained security for this event. You don't have authorization to... I know. If this goes wrong, I know that too. He looked at her. Do you have a better option? She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She had been running the alternatives in her head since the coordination room, and she knew as well as he did that the better options had narrowed considerably once they'd established that Warren Slade had access to the security department's internal communications and was almost certainly monitoring them. There are 2 officers I trust, she said finally. Completely. They've been with me 3 years before this posting. They came with me from my previous position, and they have no connection to Warren's network. How confident are you? She didn't hesitate, completely. Then position them at the kitchen corridor entrance and the north branch access. Not visibly, I don't want anyone who's watching the corridor to see a change in posture before the second course. But I want them close enough that when I give the signal, what's the signal? Gavin thought about it for a second. I'll say maintenance issue on your earpiece. That's it. And if you don't have a chance to say anything, then you'll hear something that sounds less organized, he said. And you come in. Naomi looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between professional skepticism and something that might have been, under other circumstances, grudging respect. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a small communications earpiece, the compact kind, nearly invisible at a casual glance, and handed it to him. Channel 4, she said. My 2 officers are already on it. Warren's people won't be monitoring that frequency because it's not in the event security protocol, he wrote. Gavin put it in. Smart. I've been watching Warren Slade operate for 3 years, she said. I started having doubts 14 months ago. I didn't have anything I could prove until tonight. She paused. Owen Voss's documentation, whatever's in that envelope, that's what we've been missing. He spent 6 weeks building it, Gavin said, from hiding.
I know how long he's been gone.
She said it quietly, and with the particular flatness of someone who'd been worrying about something and hadn't been able to say so out loud. We were colleagues. Before he went into the field on the internal investigation, Gavin looked at her. He didn't tell me he had a colleague inside. He wouldn't have, she said. Compartmentalization. If I didn't know what he knew and someone came after me, I couldn't confirm anything. She stopped. Is he actually all right? The note read like him, Gavin said. Same way of writing. He was scared but functional. That's as much as I can tell you. She nodded. Then she put her professional face back on the watchful, still quality that was her working mode and said, "I'll position my people. You stay out of sight until I signal that the second course has started." She left through the kitchen corridor entrance, and Gavin was alone in the service hallway, with the low strip lighting and the sound of 300 people enjoying dinner on the other side of a wall. He stood in the alcove and thought, not for the first time that evening, about what Warren Slade would have had to tell himself over 9 years to get from a trusted employee to this. You didn't arrive at conspiring to coerce a signature from your employer overnight. There were steps, compromises that seemed small at the time, payments that looked manageable, decisions that you could rationalize, because the thing you were doing wasn't the worst possible thing. And then the thing that felt manageable wasn't manageable anymore. And the people who'd been paying you knew enough about you that you couldn't stop, and you told yourself you were just doing what you had to do, and 9 years went by. Gavin had seen it before. Not the corporate version, but the human version of it, the slow accumulation of wrong turns, each one made easier by the last. He didn't have a lot of sympathy for it, but he understood the shape of it, which was a different thing. His earpiece crackled quietly. "First course is clearing," Naomi's voice said, barely above a murmur. "Second course in approximately 8 minutes. He settled into the alcove and waited. The thing about waiting that nobody talked about was how much of the actual work it was. People thought the action was the hard part. The action was, in some ways, the easy part, because in the action there were specific things to do, and your body knew how to do them, and the decisions collapsed down to a very small set of immediate options. The waiting was where you had to hold everything at once: the plan, the contingencies, the things you hadn't planned for, the position of the door, the sound of footsteps, distance and angle and timing, without letting any of it tip over into the kind of anticipatory tension that would slow you down when it mattered. Gavin had spent a significant portion of his adult life waiting. He was good at it. He heard the kitchen corridor door open at 6 minutes and knew from the sound of it too quiet, too deliberate. None of the noise a genuine catering staff member would make moving equipment through that it wasn't hotel staff. One person. He tracked the footsteps, unhurried, moving along the west wall of the corridor toward the north branch, stopping. Then the second sound, the north branch access, the soft click of a door being opened without the usual mechanism, which confirmed the card reader bypass was being used. 2 people now. The first was holding position near the kitchen entrance. The second had come in from the north branch and was moving toward the midpoint of the corridor. They were taking up positions on either side of Vivienne's route. Gavin stayed completely still in the alcove and let them settle. He counted their positions against his mental map of the corridor. The one from the kitchen entrance was approximately 30 feet to his south. The one from the north branch was approximately 15 feet to his north. He was between them. His earpiece gave him Naomi's voice, barely audible. "Second course is being served. She's at the table. 1 minute, maybe 2. He waited. Then from the ballroom side of the service entrance, the door that led from the corridor directly into the back area, adjacent to the ballroom, he heard footsteps. Different cadence. Heels on the floor, which meant Vivienne, but also a deliberateness that told him she was managing her pace carefully. She was coming. He heard the man from the kitchen entrance shift, a small repositioning, someone getting ready to move. The one from the north branch had gone entirely still, which was, counterintuitively, louder in its own way. The service entrance door opened. Vivienne came through it into the corridor. She was holding her phone at her side, down low against her dress where it wasn't obvious. And Gavin had time to register 2 things simultaneously: that the phone screen was dark, which meant she'd turned the display off, and that she was recording. He hadn't told her to do that. She'd decided to do it herself. He made a very quick decision and held his position for 2 more seconds, long enough for the man from the kitchen entrance to step out of the shadow along the west wall and move toward her. The man said, "Miss Harrow, I need you to come with me, please." It was said in the professional, neutral tone of someone who was practicing a performance they'd rehearsed, and Vivienne stopped and looked at him with an expression that was just the right amount of startled. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Security." "There's a situation that requires your immediate—" Gavin stepped out of the alcove. He came in fast and low from the man's left side, which was his blind side, because the man was focused on Vivienne, and he didn't give him time to process or pivot or do anything except react, which was too slow. It was over in a few seconds, a controlled takedown that put the man on the floor with his arm held at an angle that made standing up a bad idea. The man grunted once, sharply, and then went quiet, because Gavin applied just enough pressure to make the alternative clear. "Don't," Gavin said. The man didn't. Vivienne had not screamed. She had stepped back against the wall and kept the phone recording and was watching him with an expression that was shaken but deliberate. A person who had decided to be in this situation and was now living with that decision. "There's a second one at the North Branch," Gavin said to her. "Behind you to your left." "Don't move toward him," she didn't. Gavin looked up at the North Branch entrance and found the second man already there, older, heavier, and holding something that Gavin's peripheral vision cataloged in about a quarter of a second as a taser, not a firearm, which was consistent with the plan he'd overheard. They needed Vivienne functional enough to sign a document. He was calculating the geometry of the situation, the man on the floor whose arm he was holding, the distance to the second operative, the position of Vivienne against the wall when every light in the building went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming. Everything, all at once, from full brightness to complete darkness, with the kind of absolute totality that you only got when the backup systems had also been disabled. Strip lighting at the floor level went with everything else. The only light was the faint glow of Vivienne's phone screen, which she'd instinctively raised, and which illuminated approximately 3 feet of corridor in every direction. From beyond the service entrance door came the sound of 300 people reacting to sudden darkness, a collective intake of breath, a scrape of chairs, someone's champagne glass hitting the floor, and then voices rising in the particular pitch of alarmed confusion. Gavin kept his grip on the man on the floor. Then the man on the floor did something Gavin hadn't anticipated. He stopped resisting and went completely limp. Not the limpness of someone who'd given up. The deliberate limpness of someone who knew the lights were going out and had been waiting for them. When you anticipated the darkness, and your opponent didn't, you had exactly one advantage, and it lasted about 3 seconds. The man rolled, taking the pain in his arm as the cost of breaking the hold, and came up running. Gavin lunged after him and caught only the edge of his jacket before the man hit the service entrance door and was through it and into the chaotic blackness of the ballroom. Gone. Gavin stood in the corridor and looked toward the North Branch. The second operative was also gone, had moved during the same 3 seconds, using the darkness the way it was intended to be used. Vivienne was beside him. He could feel her presence more than see her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Her voice was steady. "Plan the blackout." "Yes." "As a contingency." "Yes." He was already thinking through it. If the main operation failed, if something interrupted the corridor interception, the blackout gave them a second window. Chaos created opportunities for movement and separation that a controlled environment didn't. And in the darkness and confusion, a panicked crowd was much harder to manage than an orderly one. But it also told him something. "Warren," he said. "What?" "Warren is the only person who could trigger a full building blackout from inside the security infrastructure. The backup systems don't go down accidentally." He was already moving toward the North Branch. "He's not in the monitoring suite anymore." "Where is he?" Gavin thought about the path the blind spots created, the continuous route from the service corridor through the loading area access. The forged transfer documents that still needed a signature. The outside contractors who needed to receive those documents and leave the building cleanly. He thought about where you would go if your primary operation had just been disrupted, and you were a man who had spent 9 years building protocols and knew every exit. "He's going down," Gavin said. "Underground loading area. He'll have the documents there, and he'll have whoever is receiving them, and he'll be trying to find another way to get what he came for before the blackout window closes and everything goes to light." He looked at Vivienne in the near darkness. "I need you to stay here." "No," she said. "Vivienne, I'm not waiting in a dark corridor while you go after the man who just tried to force me to sign away everything I've spent 9 years building." She said it with a quiet iron flatness that wasn't anger. Exactly, it was something that had moved past anger into the territory of absolute clarity. "Tell me what I can do that doesn't put me in the way." He looked at her for a moment. "Your phone," he said. "Keep recording. And when Naomi's people get to you, and they will be here inside 60 seconds, because she's been waiting for this, you go with them, you stay with them, and you give me 30 minutes. 30 minutes for what?" "To end this," he said. He didn't wait for her to agree. He was already moving toward the North Branch into the darkness, following a path he'd memorized from a schematic on a monitor screen 20 minutes ago. Behind him, he heard Vivienne say something quiet, not quite at him, and then the sound of running footsteps from the kitchen corridor direction, which was Naomi's people arriving exactly when Naomi had said they would. The North Branch access door was open. Gavin went through it and began moving down toward the underground level, into the particular quality of darkness that existed below a building full of noise and light, 300 people who had no idea what was moving through the walls below them. The loading area was 2 floors down. He took the stairs 2 at a time, one hand on the rail for orientation, and did not slow down. Warren Slade had a head start and 9 years of inside knowledge. But Gavin had spent 11 years learning to move through the dark after people who thought they'd already won, and not one of those 11 years had felt wasted tonight. He hit the bottom landing, found the door by touch, and pushed through into the underground air cold. Slightly damp, smelling of concrete and vehicle exhaust, and something metallic that took him a half-second to place. Generator fuel. The backup power systems for the loading area were down here, which meant whoever had cut the building's power had done it from somewhere very close to where he was standing. Gavin pressed himself against the wall and let his eyes adjust. And in the darkness ahead of him, barely visible, he saw the thin line of light coming from under a door that should have been completely dark. Someone was in there. More than one someone, based on the sound of voices low, tense, the kind of conversation that happened between people who knew something had gone wrong and were trying to decide what to do about it. He pressed close to the door and listened. Warren Slade's voice, unmistakable even through the door, said, "Change the approach. We get one more window before this becomes unrecoverable. The documents are here, the wire is ready, and I am not walking away from 9 years of... The window is closing," another voice said, harder and more controlled. "Your man failed upstairs. The woman is with security. We need to extract. She's somewhere in this building," Warren said. "In the dark, with Limited, with Calder's people," the second voice said, "which means she's not alone and she's not accessible. Warren, listen to me. We extract now, we regroup, we find another... There is no other approach," Warren said, and his voice had shifted into something that was less controlled, more exposed. This was the approach. "I spent 3 years positioning for tonight. You cannot get what you came for tonight," the second voice said. "That decision has been made. The question now is whether we leave clean or we leave loud." Silence. Gavin had heard enough. He had also heard enough to know that the room contained at least 2 people and the documents that Warren had referenced, and that the window for this to go anywhere other than very badly was approximately as long as it took Warren Slade to stop talking himself into corners and start making exit decisions. He straightened up from the door. He was unarmed, he was alone, and he was about to walk into a room that contained at least 2 men who had been planning this operation for 3 years and were not going to be reasonable about it. He thought briefly about the rational case for waiting for holding position, for letting Naomi's people catch up, for not doing anything that a sensible person would look at and immediately identify as tactically problematic. Then he heard, through the door, the sound of papers being moved, the sound of a bag being zipped. They were packing up to leave, with the documents. Gavin put his hand on the door handle. He didn't go through the door immediately. "Bidman, that was the thing about 11 years of training that stayed with you, even when everything else faded the instinct to pause at the threshold, to use the 1 or 2 seconds you still had before committing, because once you went through a door, you were in whatever was on the other side of it, and there was no undoing that." He stood with his hand on the handle and he listened, and he looked at what he could see, and he built the best picture he could of what he was walking into. The light under the door was coming from the right side of the room. Single source, probably a work lamp or a phone flashlight, which meant it was throwing strong light in one direction and leaving the rest of the space in varying degrees of shadow. If he came in low and moved left immediately, he'd be in the darker half of the room before anyone got a clean look at him. 2 voices he'd heard clearly, the possibility of more that hadn't spoken. The sound of papers and a bag being handled had come from the right toward the light source, which put at least 1 person on that side. The door opened inward, toward him, which meant pushing it open would create a moment where the door itself was between him and the room. A half-second of concealment that he would have to use or waste. He took 1 breath, pushed the door open, went in low and left. The room was larger than he'd expected a loading bay staging area, the kind of space designed to receive freight before it was moved further into the building. Concrete floors, exposed ceiling infrastructure, a row of heavy-duty shelving units along the far wall stacked with hotel supply inventory. The light source was a battery-powered work lamp sitting on a folding table near the right wall, and around that table were 4 people. Warren Slade was one of them. Gavin recognized him from the photographs Naomi had pulled on her tablet earlier in the evening, early 50s. Silver-haired, built with the solid, unremarkable quality of a man who'd spent decades being the background presence in rooms rather than the center of them. He was wearing his security director's credentials on a lanyard around his neck, which struck Gavin as either habitual or deeply ironic given the circumstances. The second man, the harder voice from outside the door, was younger, maybe 40, with the careful stillness of someone who'd done operational work at some point in his life. He had a bag half-zipped on the table in front of him, and his hands had stopped moving the moment the door opened. The third and fourth were flanking positions, one near the shelving wall and one near a secondary door on the room's far side that Gavin hadn't known about from the schematic. That was the first problem. He'd mapped this space from a building diagram that was evidently not complete, and the secondary door meant there was an exit route he hadn't accounted for. The fourth man had also grabbed the hotel manager, a small, frightened-looking man in his late 40s with his name badge still clipped to his jacket, and was holding him by the arm near the shelving units. The manager's face was the white of someone who'd been scared for long enough that it had stopped being acute and become a kind of stunned, ongoing condition. All of this registered in approximately 2 seconds. Then the man near the shelving unit said, "Who the?" and started moving, and Gavin was already moving too. He didn't go for the nearest one. That was the obvious play, and obvious plays in multi-person situations created predictable geometry that the other people in the room could read and respond to. Instead, he went laterally, toward the shelving units themselves, and as he moved, he grabbed the edge of the nearest shelf, a heavy industrial unit. Steel frame, loaded with boxes of hotel supply inventory, and pulled. It didn't go over immediately. These things never did in the way they did in films. He had to put his shoulder into it and drive with his legs, and there was a half-second where nothing happened, and he was aware of how exposed he was, and then the physics caught up, and the shelving unit went over with a sound like a vehicle accident. Boxes and crates and loose inventory hitting the concrete in a cascade that was loud enough to be briefly disorienting even to people who knew it was coming, which Gavin did, and the others didn't. The man who'd been near the shelving unit was directly in the path of the falling unit and had to commit fully to getting out of the way, which meant he was out of the fight for 3 or 4 seconds. The hotel manager, released in the confusion, stumbled sideways and went down on one knee and stayed there, which was the right instinct. The man near the secondary door on the far side of the room started moving toward Gavin, and Gavin tracked him peripherally while keeping his focus on the operational man near the table. Because operational people were always the primary concern, they made better decisions under pressure, and they didn't stop at the first difficulty. The operational man had straightened up from the bag and was moving along the table's far side, keeping the table between himself and Gavin, trying to create distance and angle. He was good at it. His movements were controlled, no wasted motion, the kind of spatial awareness that came from training rather than instinct. Gavin picked up a crate from the floor, whatever had spilled from the toppled shelving, something dense and rectangular. He didn't have time to look and threw it hard at the work lamp. The lamp went over. The room went dark. For a half-second, nobody moved. Then Gavin moved. He went to where the operational man had been, not where he was projecting the trajectory of someone who'd been moving along the table's far side when the light went out, calculating where 3 more steps in that direction would put him. He was mostly right. He got a hand on the man's jacket at the shoulder seam, and the man was good enough to turn into it rather than away, which meant Gavin had to adjust, and the adjustment cost him an elbow connected with his left cheekbone, with enough force to rattle his vision and fill the left side of his face with the bright, specific pain of a solid hit. He held on anyway. They went into the table together, and the table went over, and the bag with the documents slid across the concrete floor into the darkness. The man from the secondary door reached him from behind and got an arm around his neck, and for about 4 seconds it was genuinely bad, 2 trained people working together in darkness. And Gavin was the one who'd already taken a solid hit to the face and wasn't at his best. He got one hand up between the arm and his throat before the choke could fully set, bought himself just enough airway to think, drove his elbow backward into the body behind him twice in rapid succession, felt the grip loosen on the second hit, and used the loosening to pull forward and break free. He came up and backed toward the wall, putting concrete behind him, and oriented himself by the sounds in the room. Movement to his left, the man from the shelving unit, recovered and coming around. Movement straight ahead, the operational man, who'd rolled clear of the table. The one from the secondary door was behind and to his right, maybe 8 feet, repositioning. 3 against 1 in darkness. He was calculating this with the cool, slightly detached part of his mind that took over in situations like this, not the part that felt the pain in his face or tracked the seconds counting down before someone upstairs figured out where he was when the secondary door opened. Light flooded in from the corridor beyond it. Not full light emergency lighting, the kind that ran on a separate circuit from the main systems, but enough. Standing in the doorway was Naomi Calder, with 2 people behind her. Everyone in the room stopped. The freeze lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the operational man made a decision. Gavin could see it in the way his body shifted, toward the bag on the floor rather than toward the door, and Gavin was already moving before the decision completed. He reached the bag in 3 steps and put his foot on it, and the operational man stopped. "Don't," Gavin said. His voice came out rougher than he intended because of the elbow to the face. "It's over." The man looked at him, looked at Naomi's people in the doorway, looked at the room, the overturned table, the collapsed shelving, the inventory scattered across the floor, the hotel manager still on one knee near the wall, and made the calculation that Gavin had been waiting for him to make. He straightened up and put his hands away from his body. The man from the secondary door did the same, slowly. The man from the shelving unit looked at Warren Slade. Warren hadn't moved through any of this. He'd stayed near the far wall, away from the table, and Gavin had been peripherally aware of him as a stationary presence through the whole of it, not engaging. Not fleeing, just standing there in a way that had seemed like paralysis at the time, but now looked more like a man watching his options disappear one by one and doing the math on what remained. Naomi's people moved into the room. One of them went directly to the hotel manager and helped him up. The man grabbed the offered hand and didn't let go of it, which was understandable. The second went to secure the man from the secondary door. Naomi herself crossed the room to Gavin. She looked at his face. "That's going to bruise," she said. "I know," he said.
Are you? I'm fine.
He reached down and picked up the bag. The zipper was partially open from when it had slid across the floor, and he could see the corner of a document inside heavy paper stock, the kind used for legal instruments. He didn't pull it out. "This goes directly to Vivienne." "Understood." Naomi took the bag from him and then looked across the room at Warren. Warren was looking back at her. His face was doing something complicated, not the blankness of someone who had no response, but the much harder thing of someone who was feeling several responses simultaneously and didn't know which one to let through. Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she said Warren, just his name. The way you said someone's name when there was too much behind it to fit into anything else. Warren looked away. Gavin walked to the secondary door and looked down the corridor beyond it. Emergency lighting ran in strips along the ceiling, giving everything a flat, yellowish cast. Corridor stretched away in both directions and was empty. Then his earpiece still in, remarkably gave him static, and then Naomi's voice through it said, "Main power is coming back up in 60 seconds. Building management found the cut in the basement junction box." He turned back to the room. Naomi's second officer had the operational man secured and was running through the bag's contents with careful, methodical attention. The hotel manager was sitting against the wall with his jacket straightened and the specific blank expression of someone replaying the last 30 minutes and not quite believing any of it. And Warren Slade was still standing near the far wall, looking at the floor. Gavin walked to him. Warren looked up when he got close. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and was now, for the first time, putting it down not voluntarily, but because there wasn't anywhere left to carry it. "How long?" Gavin said. Warren's jaw worked for a moment. "How long what? How long before you knew this was the only way it was going to end?" Warren looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Longer than I want to tell you." Gavin didn't say anything to that. He stepped back and let Naomi's officer take over. The lights came back on 3 minutes after that full building power, a return from total darkness to complete illumination that was slightly startling even knowing it was coming, and when they did, the room looked considerably less dramatic and considerably more like what it actually was. A concrete loading bay with 4 people who'd run a sophisticated operation and lost, scattered inventory from a shelving unit someone had pulled over, a folding table on its side, and a bag on the floor that contained documents nobody was ever going to sign. From the floor above, through the concrete, Gavin could hear the muffled sounds of 300 people responding to the return of light. Stood in the middle of the room and let himself breathe for a moment. His cheekbone was throbbing in the slow, insistent way that meant the bruise was already forming beneath the surface. He'd bitten the inside of his cheek at some point during the table collision and could taste the copper of it. His left shoulder, the one he'd used to pull the shelving unit, was going to ache for a week. He was 37 years old and had recently been telling himself that he was done with this kind of thing. And the part of him that was Sophie's father was noting very clearly that he was going to have a difficult time explaining his face tomorrow morning. Part of him that had spent 11 years doing exactly this kind of thing was already reviewing everything that had just happened with the detached professional interest of someone cataloging what had gone right and what had gone sideways and what he'd do differently if he had it over. Both parts coexisted the way they always did. He'd stopped expecting that to change. Naomi appeared beside him again. Vivienne is upstairs with my people. She's asking about you. Tell her I'm coming up. The 3 imposters from the lobby, the one from the kitchen corridor entrance, who ran during the blackout, is he secured. He came back to us, Naomi said, with a dry quality that suggested the story behind that was not uncomplicated. He made it to the lobby exit and found that the front door security had decided, without being told to, not to let anyone leave. He came back to us on his own. Smart decision. Apparently he thought so. She paused. The other 2 coat check and the service entrance are secured. My people had eyes on them when the blackout started, and they lost the opportunity to move. So we have all of them. We have all of them. She looked at the bag she was holding. And we have these. Gavin looked at the bag and then looked across the room at Warren, who was now sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and Naomi's officer standing nearby. He had the posture of someone who was very tired in a way that didn't have anything to do with physical exhaustion. His credentials were still around his neck on the lanyard, slightly askew from the chaos. Gavin thought about 9 years, about building something from nothing, being trusted completely, having access to everything, and using all of it to engineer the destruction of the person who'd given it to you. He tried to find the thing inside that arithmetic that made it make sense and couldn't quite get there. But he knew the shape of it. He'd known the shape of it for years. Gavin. Naomi's voice quieter than before. He looked at her. You should go upstairs, she said. This is mine to manage now. You should go see that it's over. He looked at the room one more time. The hotel manager was on his feet, speaking quietly to one of Naomi's officers and gesturing at the collapsed shelving with the expression of a man who was going to be filling out incident reports for a very long time. The operational man and his 2 associates were being handled with brisk, professional efficiency. Warren was staring at the floor. The bag with the documents sat on a nearby crate where Naomi had set it, its half-open zipper, showing the corner of heavy paper. Unsigned. Gavin walked to the secondary door and went through it into the corridor. The emergency lighting had shifted back to standard as the building power restored, and the hallway was now lit with the ordinary, unremarkable fluorescence of a hotel service area. He found the stairwell and went up, climbing from the underground cold through the intermediate levels to the main floor, and the closer he got to the top, the more the sounds of the building changed, the muffled, indistinct noise from below becoming the clearer, more textured sound of voices and movement, and the specific energy of a large event that had just experienced something unexpected and was in the process of deciding how to feel about it. He pushed through the door at the top of the stairwell and found himself in the corridor that ran adjacent to the ballroom. The hallway was busy now, hotel staff moving with the particular urgency of people who had a situation to manage and were managing it, 2 uniformed security officers at the far end, catering manager, speaking rapidly into a radio near the kitchen entrance. Nobody looked at him for a moment. Then the catering manager glanced over and saw his face and stopped talking. Gavin realized he probably looked fairly alarming. I need to find Naomi Calder's security detail, he said. Catering manager pointed toward a side corridor without saying anything. He found them in a small meeting room off the main hallway, 2 of Naomi's officers positioned outside the door. And inside, Vivienne Harrow sitting on the edge of a conference table with her phone still in her hand and a stillness around her that was different from the controlled stillness she'd been projecting all evening. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went immediately to his face and stayed there for a moment. You need ice. she said. I need about 12 hours of sleep, he said. Ice would help too. She looked at him with an expression that was moving through several things, at once relief, he thought. And underneath that, the specific, unsteady feeling of someone who has been holding their breath for a long time and just remembered how to exhale. She looked, in that unguarded moment, exactly her age, which was 30 years old, and had just spent the last hour and a half managing a crisis that could have ended everything she'd built. Warren, she said. Downstairs, Naomi has him the documents. The bag is with Naomi. Nobody signed anything. Something moved across her face when he said that a release of pressure that was visible even from across the room, the particular exhale of someone hearing the exact words they most needed to hear. She pressed her palm flat against the conference table for a moment, steadying herself. The recording, he said. She looked at her phone. It ran the whole time. From when I went into the corridor until... Good, he said. That's very good. He meant it. He hadn't told her to do that. Thought of it herself. Under pressure, in the dark, while a man was walking toward her in a hotel corridor, intending to coerce her. Give that to Naomi before you do anything else with it. I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the man who came at me in the corridor. You had him. He got away during the blackout. Naomi said you caught up with him downstairs. Eventually. She looked at his face again. How bad is it down there? Controlled, he said. Nobody's seriously hurt. The documents are intact. Your security corridor recording is intact. And you have 5 people in custody who can provide investigators with everything they need about how this was organized and who was paying for it. He paused. Including Warren, she was quiet again. A longer quiet, this one. He sat across from me at my mother's birthday dinner, she said. Came out almost conversationally, like a fact she was just happening to mention. He was there when I signed the papers for the North Haven land acquisition. He helped me prepare for the investor presentations. He called me when my father was sick. She stopped. And all of that time I know, Gavin said. Does it? She stopped again. Started differently. Does it get less strange? The thing where someone you trusted turns out to have been something else. Does that feeling eventually? He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which meant he didn't reach for the reassuring answer. It gets different, he said. It doesn't go away, but it gets further back. You stop reaching for it as much. She looked at him. Whatever she saw in his face, some evidence that he was speaking from something real rather than from a desire to be useful, seemed to settle something. Okay, she said. She said it like a decision. The door opened and one of Naomi's officers leaned in. Ma'am, Mr. Mercer. Miss Calder is requesting you both downstairs. Vivienne straightened up from the table. She smoothed the front of her dress, with both hands a small, practical gesture, getting herself back together, and when she looked up, she had the composed, present quality back in her face. Not performed, just chosen. She walked to the door and then stopped. Gavin, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said. Not the way people said it when they were being polite, the other way. He didn't have a good response for that, so he didn't try for one. He just nodded, and she went through the door, and he followed. The corridor was busy, and getting busier as hotel management, and the first of the emergency respondents been called, worked their way through the building. Gavin and Vivienne moved through it toward the stairwell, and nobody stopped them, and nobody gave Vivienne's evening dress or Gavin's work jacket a second look because there was too much happening. They went down the stairs together and came through the door into the loading bay corridor, and the sounds of the underground level concrete acoustics, the echo of multiple voices wrapped around them as they walked toward the staging area. Through the door, Gavin could see Naomi standing near the overturned table. The room was considerably better lit now. With building power restored, and in the full light it looked exactly like what it was, the end of a very long evening. Warren Slade was still sitting on the floor. When Vivienne came through the door and he saw her, something crossed his face that was too complicated and too private to put a name to. He looked at her for a moment and then looked at the floor again and didn't say anything. Neither did she. She looked at him for a long moment, the man who'd been present for 9 years of her life, who'd built the structure that was supposed to keep her safe, who'd been using that same structure to work against her for reasons that were still going to take time to fully understand. She looked at him with an expression that had grief in it and was not trying to hide that it had grief in it, and then she turned away. She turned to Naomi and said, "Show me the documents." Naomi gave her the bag. Vivienne opened it and went through the papers with a focused, quiet attention, reading each page with the care of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at and why it mattered. The room was very still while she did it. Even the people who were doing other things seemed to do them more quietly. She got to the last page, the signature line, which was blank, which would remain blank, and she closed the bag. She said, "These go to our legal team tonight." Her voice was entirely steady. "I want our attorneys to have everything before morning, and I want Owen Voss's documentation from the envelope in our legal team's hands simultaneously." She looked at Gavin. "Is there a way to reach Owen safely?" "I have a number he gave me for emergencies," Gavin said. "He'll answer." "Then call him," she said. "Tell him it's over. Tell him it's safe to come back." She said it simply, and she meant it simply, and Gavin believed her. He reached into his pocket for his phone. The screen had a crack in it that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening some point during the table collision, he guessed, but it still worked. He found the number and dialed it. It rang 4 times. 5. He was preparing for voicemail when the line connected, and the quality of the silence on the other end was the specific silence of someone who had been waiting for a call and hadn't believed it was actually going to come. "Owen," Gavin said. "It's done." A long pause. Then Owen Voss's voice, rougher than Gavin remembered, compressed with weeks of something that didn't have a clean word for itself, said, "How bad?" "Your documentation held," Gavin said. "We have the physical evidence. We have corroboration. And Vivienne's attorney is going to have everything tonight. You need to come in." Another pause. "Warren," Owen said. Gavin looked across the room at Warren Slade, who was still looking at the floor. "He's here," Gavin said. "He'll cooperate. He doesn't have anything left to protect." Owen said, "All right." Just that. "All right." Like a man who had been bracing against something for 6 weeks and was finally carefully letting himself stop. "Where are you?" Gavin asked. Owen gave him a location, a motel about 40 minutes from the hotel, the kind of anonymous cash-paying establishment that was specifically designed to be forgettable. Gavin wrote the address on the back of a receipt from his jacket pocket because it was what he had. "Someone will come get you," Gavin said. "Stay put." He ended the call and looked at Naomi. "He's 40 minutes out," he said. "He needs someone to go to him." "I'll send Marcus," Naomi said. There was the faintest irony in that Marcus, who had nearly walked Gavin out of the lobby 2 hours ago, being sent on the errand that closed the circle. He's been standing in the lobby looking like he wants to be useful. From somewhere above them, through the concrete of 2 floors, Gavin heard the sound of the building, voices, movement, particular orchestral quality of a large space, where 300 people were collectively working out what they'd just been through, and deciding that the appropriate response was probably to finish dinner. He looked at the crack in his phone screen. He looked at his watch. It was 11:47. Sophie would be asleep. She was always asleep by 8:30, which was the one rule she followed without negotiation, possibly because she'd worked out that being asleep meant tomorrow came faster. She'd be under her blanket with the yellow stars and the stuffed dog named Captain that she'd had since she was 3 years old and still slept with, even though she was now emphatic that she was much too old for stuffed animals. Tomorrow morning she would wake up and want to know about his face, and he was going to have to come up with something that was technically honest without being the kind of story that made 7-year-olds worry. He put the phone back in his pocket. Vivienne was speaking quietly with Naomi about the legal handoff, and Naomi was making notes on her tablet, and the 2 officers had the 4 detained men organized near the far wall, and the hotel manager, who appeared to have found some reserves of resilience, was on his phone with what sounded like building management, working through the logistics of what came next. In the middle of all of it, Warren Slade sat on the floor with his lanyard around his neck and looked at nothing. Gavin didn't have anything left to say to him. He walked to the overturned table and set it upright, not because anyone asked him to, but because it was in the way, and he needed something to do with his hands for a moment. The table went up with a scrape of metal on concrete, and the sound of it made everyone in the room look at him briefly, and then they went back to what they'd been doing. He looked at the room around him, the collapsed shelving, the scattered inventory, the crack of light still visible under the far wall where the work lamp had rolled during the fight and not quite gone out. He looked at all of it with the particular quality of attention you gave to places where things had happened, the way those places stayed with you even after you left them. Then he let it go and turned back toward the door. There was still a lot of work ahead of them tonight, and morning was not as far away as it felt. The authorities arrived at 12:23 in the morning. Gavin knew the exact time, because he'd looked at his watch when he heard the first radio call from the lobby, 2 plainclothes detectives, and a 4-person response unit, which was a reasonable deployment for a situation that had been described to the dispatcher as a corporate security incident with multiple detainees and evidence of organized fraud. He was standing near the staging area door when they came through, and he stepped aside and let Naomi handle the introductions because it was her event, her jurisdiction, and her paperwork that was going to follow this for the next several months. He found a folding chair near the wall and sat down on it and let the room do what rooms did after something like this, fill up with process, with the procedural rhythms of people whose job it was to arrive after the fact and make sense of what they found. The detectives moved through the space with flashlights and notebooks, photographing the overturned shelving and the scattered inventory and the folding table that Gavin had set upright earlier. One of them crouched near the work lamp that was still lying on its side near the far wall and looked at it for a long moment before moving on. Warren was still sitting on the floor when the detectives reached him. Gavin watched that part without meaning to. One of the detectives, a woman in her mid-40s with the kind of unhurried competence that came from doing this work long enough to stop being impressed by any version of it, crouched to Warren's level and spoke to him quietly. Warren listened. His hands were in his lap, and he was looking at the detective with the expression of a man who had been decisive somewhere in the preceding hour exactly how much fight he had left in him and had arrived at a number that was close to 0. He said something to the detective that Gavin couldn't hear from across the room. The detective straightened up and said something to her partner. Whatever Warren had said, it was apparently enough to shift the procedural approach, because the partner immediately got on his radio, and the tempo in the room changed slightly, a subtle increase in purposefulness, people realigning around a new piece of information. Naomi appeared beside Gavin's chair. "He's talking," she said. "I can see that. He asked for a specific prosecutor." She paused. "By name. He knows who handles organized financial crime cases in this district, and he asked for that person specifically. Which means he's not improvising. He thought about this. Cooperation angle." Gavin looked at Warren across the room. He's been sitting on an exit strategy, apparently. Naomi's voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before, not quite anger, more like the exhaustion that lives on the other side of a long professional disappointment. 9 years of building an exit strategy while simultaneously building the thing you're planning to exit from. Gavin didn't say anything. He was watching the detective speak to Warren, watching Warren's measured, careful responses, and recognizing the specific manner of a person who had been holding a very heavy secret for a very long time and was now, with visible relief, in the process of setting it down. There was something almost pitiful about it. He didn't feel much pity, but he recognized the shape of it. "Vivienne," he said. "She's upstairs with her attorney. He arrived about 15 minutes ago. Apparently she called him the moment the power came back on." Naomi almost smiled at that. "He got here in 22 minutes, which I'm told is impressive given where he lives." "Good. She wants to speak with Warren before they take him in. Her attorney is advising against it. What does she want to do?" "I think she wants to do it anyway." Naomi paused. "I think she needs to hear it from him directly. Not from a report. Not from a detective. From him." Gavin understood that. It wasn't the tactically smart move, and it wasn't what a lawyer would recommend, and it was entirely human. "Her call," he said. "Yes." Naomi looked at him. "You should get that looked at." She meant his face. The left side of it had settled into a steady, deep ache that was going to get worse before it got better. "There's a paramedic unit outside. In a while." She gave him the look of someone who knew that in a while meant probably not tonight, and chose not to argue with it. The room continued its work around them. The 4 detained men, the operational lead, and the 3 supporting operatives were processed in sequence, read their rights, and separated for individual transport. The operational man, to his credit, said nothing to anyone without his attorney present, and maintained that position with a disciplined calm that Gavin found professionally respectable, even given the context. The documents in the bag were photographed in place, inventoried, and placed into an evidence container by a technician who handled them with the careful attention of someone who understood their significance. The bag itself was tagged and sealed. Gavin watched the transfer of documents into the evidence chain and felt something settle that had been sitting unsettled in him since he'd first walked into the Sterling Crown at 7:43 with an envelope under his arm. Those pages were unsigned. They were going to remain unsigned. Whatever they represented, however many years of preparation and calculation had gone into having them ready on a table in a loading bay, they were now evidence in a criminal prosecution rather than instruments. Transfer, which was exactly where they belonged. He reached into his jacket pocket and found his phone. He looked at the cracked screen for a moment, then navigated to his contacts and found the number listed simply as his neighbor, Mrs. Farrell, who stayed with Sophie on the evenings when Gavin had something that ran past 7. He'd texted her at 8:30 to say he was running late. That text felt like it was from a different week. He typed, "Still working. Probably another hour. I'll pay you double. Sorry." The response came back in under a minute. "She's been asleep since 8. Take your time. She's fine." He put the phone away. Sophie was fine. She was asleep under the blanket with the yellow stars, and Captain the stuffed dog was in his usual position at the foot of the bed because Sophie maintained that she was too old to sleep with stuffed animals, but somehow Captain always ended up there anyway. She was fine. He sat with that for a moment, the way you sat with something that you needed to feel fully rather than just know. Then Vivienne Harrow came through the door. She had someone with her, a man in his 50s with a briefcase and the air of a person who was professionally unhappy about this situation, but had accepted that his professional unhappiness was not going to change it. Her attorney, presumably. He stayed near the door while Vivienne crossed the room toward the lead detective, exchanged a few words, and then looked at Warren. Warren looked back at her. The room didn't go quiet. There was too much happening for that. But the people nearest to where Vivienne and Warren were standing seemed to find reasons to be slightly less present, giving the moment a small amount of space that was the best available approximation of privacy in a loading bay containing 12 people and an active evidence collection. Vivienne stood in front of Warren and looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Warren was still on the floor, which made the geometry of it strange her standing, him seated. The power arrangement reversed from every professional interaction they'd ever had. He didn't try to get up. Maybe the detective had told him not to. Maybe he'd made a different calculation. "I need you to tell me when it started," Vivienne said. Her voice was controlled and quiet, and Gavin could hear it from the chair because the acoustics of a concrete room carried things whether you wanted them to or not. He wasn't trying to listen, and he wasn't going to pretend he wasn't. Warren looked at his hands. "The first payment was 7 years ago," he said. "Before North Haven, before any of this. 7 years. It seemed at the time, it seemed like something I could manage. Like it was separate from everything else." He stopped. "I know how that sounds. Tell me anyway," he told her. His voice was flat and careful, in the manner of someone who had rehearsed this in their head, enough times that the recitation no longer felt fully connected to the thing it was describing. He'd been approached through an intermediary, someone he knew from a previous professional life, before he came to work for Vivienne with an offer that had presented itself as a simple consulting arrangement. Background information on security protocols. The kind of thing that seemed, in isolation, like a minor transgression rather than a betrayal. The first payment had been substantial. The second had been slightly less, which was its own kind of psychology, the second payment feeling more ordinary because the first had already established the precedent. By the time the requests moved from general security information to specific details about North Haven, Warren had been receiving payments for 8 months and had reached the point where stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. "There's always a point like that," Gavin said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Warren looked at him. So did Vivienne. He said it again, more deliberately this time. "There's always a point where stopping seems more dangerous than going forward. That's how it works. It's designed to work that way." Warren looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. Not gratitude exactly, not defensiveness. Something more like the look of a man who had just heard the mechanism of something described aloud, and was registering, for the first time, that it was a mechanism that it had been engineered, rather than naturally occurring. "Doesn't excuse it," Gavin said. "Just so we're clear." "I know," Warren said. Vivienne looked at Gavin for a moment and then looked back at Warren. "Who was running the operation?" "On the outside." "A holding group," Warren said. 3 entities, layered. The visible one is a development consultancy called Meridian Vance. They've been positioning to acquire North Haven's coastal parcels for 2 years. If the transfer had gone through, they would have consolidated the acquisition within 30 days. And the people behind Meridian Vance, investment group. The name they use for external communications is different from the name on the internal documents. I'll give your investigators everything I have on the structure. He paused. That's what I told the detective. Full cooperation. Everything. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Gavin watched her face, the way she was processing what 9 years of proximity to this man looked like in retrospect. Every conversation, every dinner, every professional decision that he'd been present for, all of it now having to be re-examined through a different lens. That was the particular cruelty of this kind of betrayal. It didn't just affect what had happened tonight. It reached backward through time and altered the texture of everything you remembered. You were there, she said quietly, when my father was sick. Warren looked up at her. The professional composure he'd been maintaining shifted, just barely, into something older and less managed. Yes, he said. Was that? She stopped. Was any of it real? Any of the 9 years? Warren was quiet for long enough that the silence itself became an answer of sorts. Then he said the work was real. The loyalty to the work that was real. I don't expect you to believe that. You're right, she said. I don't. She said it without anger. Anger would have been easier to hear. The flatness of it, the factual, final quality was harder. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned away. Her attorney immediately materialized at her elbow with the instinct of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this cue, and she walked with him toward the far end of the room where they spoke in quiet, quick consultation. Gavin stood up from the chair. His body registered the change in position, with a series of complaints that were more specific than the general ache from earlier. His shoulder in particular had developed a more pointed objection, and the bruise on his cheekbone had progressed from throbbing to the kind of steady, radiating pressure that told him the swelling had gotten genuinely started. He stood up anyway, because sitting had started to feel like a decision he was making rather than a position he'd fallen into. And he didn't want to be making that decision in a loading bay at 12:30 in the morning. He crossed to the door and stepped into the corridor. The hallway outside was cooler and quieter, the emergency lighting now supplemented by the building's full restoration. And he stood in it for a moment and just breathed the slightly stale underground air and let himself be still. From somewhere above him, he could still hear the faint sounds of the building voices, movement, the distant specific sounds of 300 guests navigating the end of an unusual evening, and the contrast between that and the concrete corridor was pronounced enough to feel almost physical. The door behind him opened and Vivienne came through it. She stopped when she saw him, which told him she hadn't followed him specifically, but had coincidentally taken the same exit. Her attorney was not with her, which meant she'd shed him long enough to have a moment that wasn't managed. She stood in the corridor and looked at the wall across from her. Gavin waited. 7 years, she said finally. He said 7 years. I hired him 9 years ago, which means he was already in contact with them by the time he'd been with me 2 years. Yes. And I never, she stopped. I had no indication. Nothing that he was good at it, Gavin said. People who do this at that level are specifically good at not giving indications. That's not a comfortable thing to say, but it's accurate. She looked at him. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, he said. It's just true. She almost laughed, not quite, but something close to it moved across her face and then retreated. You're not very good at comfort, I know. He paused. I'm better at accurate. She looked at him for a moment in the flat light of the corridor, and there was something in the quality of that look not quite evaluating, not quite grateful, something more like the look you gave a person when you were seeing them clearly for the first time, and finding the view not what you expected, and also not a disappointment. What do you do, she said, when the thing that's supposed to be protecting you turns out to be the thing working against you? After. What do you do after? He thought about it. He thought about the 11 years of training that had been organized around exactly this principle, that the thing you built to keep you safe was only as trustworthy as the people who built it, and people were the variable that no system could fully account for. You rebuild, he said. Not the same thing. Something that accounts for what you learned. He paused. And you do it with people you choose more carefully the second time. Vivienne looked at him. And how do you choose more carefully? You look for the ones who have something to lose, he said. Not the ones who have nothing to lose, because those people will trade anything. The ones who have something they're protecting, something real. Outside of work, those are the ones who have a reason to hold the line. She was quiet for a moment. Like you. He didn't answer that one directly. She didn't push it. She shifted, straightening slightly, And when she spoke again, the quality of her voice had moved back toward the professional register. Not because she was shutting the other thing down, but because she was the kind of person who could hold both at once and knew when it was time to move. I'm going to need to rebuild the entire security infrastructure, she said. Not just personnel. The protocols, the systems, the access architecture. All of it has to be treated as compromised. She paused. Warren wrote most of it. I know. Which means I need someone who can look at what he built and understand what was designed to look protective and what was actually designed to serve a different purpose. Gavin looked at her. That's a significant job, he said. And a long one. Yes, I fix houses, he said. I'm home by 5. I know, she said. You mentioned that. He was quiet for a moment. What exactly are you asking? I'm not asking anything tonight, she said. Tonight we both go home and sleep, and tomorrow there are going to be lawyers and investigators and an amount of administrative aftermath that I don't want to think about yet. She met his eyes. But I am going to call you in a few weeks, and when I do, I'd like you to actually pick up. Gavin looked at her for a moment. I'll pick up, he said. She nodded. Then she went back through the door into the staging area, and Gavin remained in the corridor, and from somewhere above him, the sounds of the building continued their gradual process of returning to normal. He stood there for another minute, not thinking about much, letting his mind do the thing it needed to do after a long night not shutting down. Exactly. But stepping back from the edge of full engagement, beginning the slow transition toward the ordinary. Then he went back inside and found Naomi. She was at the far end of the staging area, speaking with one of the detectives in the methodical, detailed way that was going to be her reality for the next several hours at minimum. She had the tablet out and was scrolling through something while she talked. She looked up when Gavin approached and held up one finger weight and finished the point she was making to the detective, who wrote something in his notebook and moved away. Owen got here 15 minutes ago, she said. Marcus brought him in through the east entrance. Gavin felt something he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the moment he'd told Owen. It was done a low-level tension that belonged to the category of things you didn't know you were carrying until they weren't there anymore. How is he? He said. Thin, Naomi said. Tired. He looks like a man who's been sleeping in motels for 6 weeks and managing a level of stress that would have put most people on their backs. She paused. He asked about Warren. What did you tell him? The truth. That he's talking. She paused again. Owen looked at the floor for a while when I told him that. He knew Warren. Not as well as Vivienne, but he'd worked with him. That's a specific kind of difficult. Where is he now? Upstairs. Vivienne's attorney took his deposition or started to. It's going to be a long process. She looked at Gavin. You should go, you know. There's nothing left here that requires you specifically. I can handle the procedural end. I know. The paramedic unit is still outside. You said that before. You still haven't gone. He looked at her. I'll go to the paramedic unit if you stop mentioning the paramedic unit. She held up both hands in a brief gesture that acknowledged the logic of that without agreeing with it. He went. The paramedic unit was a van parked on the service side of the hotel, which was the only entrance that hadn't been complicated by the arrival of police vehicles and the continued presence of a significant number of confused, well-dressed people who had just lived through an unusual gala. Paramedic was a young woman who looked at his face with professional neutrality and told him the cheekbone wasn't fractured, which he'd already calculated, and that the swelling was going to be its worst tomorrow and he should ice it tonight. She gave him a cold pack from the van's supply. He held it against his cheek and sat on the van's bumper for a moment and looked at the service alley, the loading bays and dumpsters, and the 2 police vehicles parked at angles, their lights off, and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of rest. At 1:41 in the morning, he walked to where he'd parked his truck 6 blocks from the hotel because the closer spaces had been full when he arrived at 7:30, and he hadn't wanted to pay the garage rate. Truck was a 12-year-old Ford that had been many things in its life and currently served as the vehicle by which he transported tools to job sites and one 7-year-old to school and soccer practice. The passenger seat had a booster chair in it and a library book that Sophie had left there 3 days ago. He started the engine and sat for a moment with the heater beginning to work. He looked at the library book. It was about deep-sea creatures, anglerfish, and giant squid, and the kind of organisms that lived in total darkness at the bottom of the ocean. Sophie had been on a deep-sea phase for about 6 weeks, which had followed a volcano phase and preceded what he suspected was going to be a weather phase based on the questions she'd been asking about tornadoes. He picked up the book and looked at the cover, an anglerfish with its bioluminescent lure glowing in illustrated blackness, and put it back. Then he pulled out of the parking space and drove home. The drive took 23 minutes at that hour. The city quiet, in the way that cities got quiet in the deep part of the night. Traffic lights cycling through their sequences for empty intersections. He drove without music, which was his habit when he was processing something, and let the streetlights go by. He thought about Warren Slade, speaking to that detective with the careful precision of a man who had spent years thinking about this conversation. He thought about the shape of it, 8 months of initial payments, the gradual normalization, the point where stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, the mechanism of it. He'd described it to Warren accurately. It was designed to work that way. The people who built these structures knew exactly what they were doing, knew how to make each step feel like the logical extension of the step before, knew how to use the accumulated weight of previous decisions to make the next decision feel inevitable. It didn't excuse it. But understanding the mechanism of something was different from excusing it, and Gavin had spent enough of his professional life dealing with compromised people, people who had made decisions under pressure that they couldn't take back, to know that the binary of guilty and innocent covered a lot of complicated ground that wasn't actually binary at all. Warren was guilty. He was also, in some sense, that Gavin didn't feel obligated to be sympathetic about, a person who had been systematically worked on for years by people who were very skilled at the specific work of turning someone inside out. Both of those things were true simultaneously. The traffic light at Prentice and 7th turned red, and Gavin stopped for it. And in the quiet of the truck at the empty intersection, he thought about Vivienne, saying, was any of it real? Was any of the 9 years real? And Warren's answer, the work was real. The loyalty to the work was real, and the flatness in Vivienne's voice when she said she didn't believe him. She might be right not to believe him. Or she might believe him eventually, when the acute part of it had passed and she could look at 9 years with more distance and see the parts that were genuine inside the frame of the betrayal. Gavin didn't know which it would be, and it wasn't his to know. The light turned green. He drove the last 8 minutes to his neighborhood, the middle part of a city, not wealthy and not struggling, the kind of neighborhood that had hardware stores and a decent pizza place and a school within walking distance, and people who most kept their yards up because there was a quiet social consensus that this was what you did. His house was a 2-bedroom on Callaway Street that he'd bought 4 years ago because it was the right size. And the structural bones of it were sound, even if everything cosmetic needed work, which it had, and which he'd done in the evenings over the course of that first year. He parked in the driveway and cut the engine. The house was dark except for the porch light, which Mrs. Farrell always left on when she stayed, and the faint glow from the streetlight that came through the front window and touched the living room in the amber way he'd become familiar with over 4 years. He sat in the truck for a moment. Then he got out, went up the porch steps. The second one still creaked. He kept meaning to fix it. He would fix it next weekend, and unlocked the door as quietly as he could manage. The house smelled like the particular combination of things that were specifically and only his house. The coffee he'd made that morning, Sophie's library books, the faint residue of whatever cleaning product Mrs. Farrell used when she tidied up without being asked. He moved through the dark living room without turning on any lights, past the couch with the throw pillow that Sophie had relocated to the floor, and he'd relocated back twice this week, past the small table with the drawing she'd done at school that was mostly a horse, but had enough ambiguity that Gavin had been careful never to express complete certainty about what it was. Down the short hallway to her door, which was half open in the way he kept it so he could hear her if she called. He pushed it open slowly and looked in. Sophie was asleep on her side, facing the wall, her dark hair spread across the pillow in the organized chaos that somehow managed to look the same every morning as it did every night. Captain the stuffed dog was at the foot of the bed, technically, though one of Sophie's feet had reached out in sleep and was resting against it. The nightlight in the corner, a small, dim thing shaped like a crescent moon that she'd had since she was forecast just enough light to see by without disturbing anything. She was breathing the slow, even breaths of genuinely deep sleep. Gavin stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't do anything. He didn't go in, didn't rearrange anything, didn't check the nightlight or adjust the blanket. He just stood there and looked at her, the way he did sometimes when he came home late from something, and needed a specific kind of confirmation that the world outside hadn't changed anything that mattered. She was 7 years old, and she still slept the way she had at 4 completely, with the full commitment of someone who had decided to be unconscious and was excellent at it. She was going to wake up tomorrow morning at 6:45, which was when she always woke up, and she was going to come into his room and announce some fact about deep-sea creatures that she'd remembered during the night. And she was going to want pancakes, and she was going to ask about his face in the direct, uncomplicated way of a child who had not yet learned that asking about someone's face was sometimes considered rude. He was going to have to think of something to say about his face. He stood in the doorway long enough that his shoulder reminded him it had opinions, and then he stepped back and pulled the door to its half-open position and went down the hall to his own room. He sat on the edge of the bed and took off his boots, the steel-toed scuffed ones he'd worn into the Sterling Crown lobby 5.5 hours ago, and set them on the floor. His jacket went over the chair. He lay back without changing anything else, and the ceiling was the ordinary ceiling of his ordinary room. And outside the window, the neighborhood was quiet, and from the next room, he could hear the specific quality of nothing that meant Sophie was still sleeping. He thought about Vivienne saying she was going to call him in a few weeks. He thought about what she was going to ask when she called, and what his answer was going to be, and what that answer was going to mean about what his days looked like going forward. He thought about Sophie's soccer game on Saturday, which he was not going to miss. He thought about the library book in the passenger seat that needed to be returned by Friday. He thought about the second porch step that needed fixing. He was still thinking about these things when sleep pulled him under, cleanly and without ceremony, somewhere around 2:20 in the morning, with the cold pack still in his hand and his phone on the nightstand and all the ordinary, specific weight of his ordinary, specific life settled around him like something he had earned the right to come back to. He had. Every time he had. Sophie asked about his face at 6:47 in the morning. She came to his room the way she always did without knocking, which was a habit he'd been meaning to address, and kept not addressing, because the sound of her door opening and her feet on the floor was one of the specific sounds his mornings were organized around, and she stood at the foot of his bed, looked at him with the particular focused attention of a 7-year-old who had noticed something and was not going to let it go. "What happened to your face?" she said. Not a question. An observation presented for explanation. "I bumped it," Gavin said. Sophie looked at him. She had her mother's eyes dark brown and deeply skeptical, a quality that had apparently skipped the infant and toddler stages entirely and arrived fully formed around age 3. She considered his answer with the expression of someone doing a calculation they already knew the result of. "On what?" she said. "A shelf." "Yes." "Dad," she said, in the tone she used when she felt she was being managed. "That is a very big bruise for a shelf." "It was a big shelf," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she apparently decided to table the issue for now, with the strategic patience of someone who knew they'd be returning to it. "I want pancakes," she said. "I know," he said. "Give me 10 minutes." He made pancakes. His face hurt, and his shoulder hurt, and he'd slept 4 hours and 30 minutes, which was not enough but was what he had. He made pancakes anyway, because it was Saturday and Saturday was pancakes, and Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her deep-sea creatures book open beside her plate and told him about the barrel-eye fish, which had a transparent head and could rotate its eyes upward to look through its own skull. "That's unsettling," Gavin said. "It's amazing," Sophie corrected. "They live where there's no light at all, and they evolved special eyes because they needed to see, and there was nothing to see with." She turned a page. "It's adaptation, right," he said. "Adaptation." He stood at the stove and flipped a pancake and thought, briefly and without meaning to, about dark rooms and the specific skill of moving through them, and then he stopped thinking about that because it was Saturday morning and there were pancakes. He did not think about the Sterling Crown Hotel for the rest of that weekend. He fixed the second porch step on Sunday afternoon, while Sophie sat on the porch railing against house rules which she observed in the breach, and narrated what he was doing with the focused commentary of a 7-year-old sports announcer. He attended her soccer game, which her team lost 4-2, and Sophie played the second half with an intensity that was out of proportion to a recreational league match for 7-year-olds, and that Gavin recognized as a family trait without having to think too hard about where it came from. He returned the library book on Friday. He did not think about Vivienne Harrow calling, because thinking about it was a different thing from whether she would, and the 2 weeks after the gala were full enough with the ordinary logistics of his life that there wasn't a lot of extra room for anticipation. Called on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the night at the Sterling Crown. He was on a job site, a kitchen renovation in a house 4 miles from his own, the kind of careful, methodical work that he'd found himself suited for in the years since he left the Navy, where the things you built stayed built and the problems were structural rather than human. He was checking measurements on a cabinet installation when his phone went off, and the screen showed a number he didn't have saved but recognized from the exchange. He set down the measuring tape and answered. "You picked up," Vivienne said. "I said I would." A brief pause. "How's your face?" "Yellow," he said. "Mostly faded." "Good." Another pause, shorter. "I need about an hour of your time this week." "Not tonight, I know you have." She stopped. "Actually, I don't know what you have. I'm assuming you have something in the evenings." "I have a 7-year-old, he said. "Right, so. Whenever works with that." They arranged it for Thursday. Late morning, at the Harrow Group's offices on the 14th floor of a building downtown that had the same architectural philosophy as the Sterling Crown built. To make people feel a certain way, though, Gavin found, walking through the lobby, that the feeling had less effect on him than it was probably designed to have. Vivienne met him herself, which surprised him. He'd expected an assistant or a conference room with people already in it. Instead, she was in the lobby when he stepped out of the elevator, in a gray suit that was the working version of how she'd looked at the gala put together but not performing. The difference between clothes chosen to be seen in and clothes chosen to work in. She looked at his face. "You weren't kidding about yellow," she said. "It's getting there," he said. She took him to her office rather than a conference room, which was a different kind of signal, less formal, more direct, the kind of space where you had conversations rather than presentations. The office had a wall of windows that looked out over the city and a desk that was covered in the organized disorder of someone who worked on multiple things simultaneously and had a system for it that wasn't obvious to outside observers. She sat behind the desk and he sat across from it, and she didn't start with small talk, which he appreciated. "Warren's cooperation agreement was formalized 4 days ago," she said. "He's providing full disclosure on the Meridian Vance, structure, the names, the entity layers, the financial channels. His attorneys negotiated a reduced charge in exchange for complete cooperation and testimony." She paused. "He'll still face significant consequences, but he'll face them faster, and the people who are actually running the operation will face the full weight of it." "How many entities in the structure?" Gavin said. 7 that we know of. Meridian Vance is the visible layer. Below that, 2 investment vehicles registered in different jurisdictions. Below that, it gets more complicated and the investigators are still working through it. She looked at him steadily. The people who approached Warren 7 years ago were not opportunists. This was a long-term acquisition strategy targeting North Haven from before the project was even publicly announced. Gavin thought about that. The scope of it, 7 years of patience, of building a structure specifically designed to eventually extract one signature from one person. The resources required to maintain that kind of operation over that kind of time. "Who benefits from North Haven specifically?" he said. "Not from the acquisition itself, from controlling the coastal development rights." Vivienne looked at him with the expression of someone who had been asking themselves the same question. "The investigators are working on that. The Meridian Vance principles aren't talking, which tells you something about what they're protecting." She paused. "Owen's documentation has been invaluable. He traced the financial flows back 14 months before he went into hiding. What he documented is the foundation of the entire prosecution case." "Is he all right?" "He came back to work last week," she said. "Officially, as an internal investigative consultant. He looks like himself again, mostly." A pause. "He asked me to tell you that the envelope was the right call. He said you'd understand what that meant." Gavin understood. The chain of evidence, the unbroken, uncontaminated documentation from Owen to Gavin to Vivienne, delivered exactly as Owen had packaged it. It had mattered in ways that would only fully become clear as the prosecution built its case, but it had mattered. "What happened to the operative who ran during the blackout?" he said. "He was picked up at a transit hub the following morning," Vivienne said. "He'd apparently decided to leave the city and reconsidered when he checked the news." She said it with the dry flatness of someone who had run through her supply of being surprised by human decisions. "He's in custody. All 5 of the people detained that night are in custody or have representation and are cooperating to varying degrees." "And the North Haven project." She looked at him. and something in her face shifted not dramatically, but the way things shifted when you touched a topic that was attached to something real. North Haven breaks ground in 11 weeks, she said. Exactly on the original schedule. She paused. We accelerated the remaining regulatory approvals by 3 weeks because it turned out the delays we'd been experiencing on those approvals were not coincidental. Someone in a reviewing office had been slowing the process. That someone has been removed. Another pause. When I say we, I mean Owen primarily. He found it. Gavin looked at her. He found it from his desk. He found it in his first 4 days back, she said. He's very good at what he does. He was wasted as a field investigator. He should always have been doing the work he's doing now. Gavin thought about Owen Voss, who'd spent 6 weeks in a motel 40 minutes from the hotel he'd been trying to protect, building a documentation package by hand because he couldn't trust the systems he normally would have used. There was a particular kind of person who did that, who kept working alone, in fear, with limited resources, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was not something they were built to do. Good, Gavin said. He meant it simply. Vivienne looked at him. Then she put her hands flat on the desk, a settling gesture, the kind that preceded something being said directly. I want to offer you a position, she said. Independent contractor, not an employee. Your own structure, your own hours, full authority over the security rebuild, personnel evaluation, system architecture, protocol rewrite, all of it. You'd answer to me directly and no one else. Gavin was quiet. Before you say anything, she said, I want to be specific about what I mean by your own hours. I mean it. I don't want someone who's going to burn through everything personal in their life to be excellent at work. I've seen what that produces. I've lived some version of it myself. She stopped. I want someone who goes home when they need to go home. Who can tell me that Thursday afternoon is unavailable and mean it? That's not a weakness in the role I'm describing, it's a requirement. He looked at her. That's an unusual thing for a CEO to say. I'm describing what I learned, she said. It came out direct and without decoration. I watched Warren Slade work 18-hour days for 9 years. I thought it was dedication. It turned out to be something else. Something I hadn't understood the shape of. She paused. I don't want someone who has nothing outside of the job. I want someone who has reasons. Gavin looked at the wall of windows behind her, the city arranged in its ordinary complexity beyond the glass. He thought about the measuring tape he'd left on the kitchen counter at the job site when he got the call. He thought about the cabinet installation that still needed 3 more days of work. He thought about Sophie's soccer practice on Tuesday and the parent-teacher meeting at the end of the month that he'd put in his calendar in capital letters because Sophie's teacher, a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who was excellent at her job and genuinely intimidating, had specifically requested that he attend. I have a condition, he said. I assumed you would. I'm not available Tuesday afternoons, he said. Soccer practice. I'm not available for the last 2 weeks of July because Sophie and I have a trip planned. I'm not available on the first day of school, which moves every year. And if she's sick, she's the priority and the job waits. Vivienne looked at him steadily. Those are reasonable conditions. They're non-negotiable ones. I understand the difference, she said. He looked at her. She was 30 years old and had been running a multi-billion-dollar development organization since she was 26, and she had the specific quality of people who had gotten to where they were through a combination of genuine intelligence and an appetite for hard work that went beyond what most people were willing to sustain. She was also, Gavin had noticed over the course of the last 3 weeks of thinking about this conversation, the kind of person who said what she meant, without requiring the other person to read between lines, which was rarer than it should have been. All right, he said. She nodded, a single decisive nod. I'll have the contract drafted by end of week. You'll want to have someone review it. I know a lawyer, he said. Good. She stood up and extended her hand across the desk, and he stood and shook it. And that was that the most significant professional agreement of his post-Navy life, concluded without ceremony in a 14th floor office on a Thursday morning. He was back on the job site by noon. The cabinet installation took 2 more days as he'd estimated. He finished it on a Friday, cleaned up the site, loaded his tools into the truck, and drove to school to pick up Sophie at 3:15. She came out the double doors in the middle of a stream of other children and spotted him at the curb and changed direction without breaking stride, which was one of the specific things he loved about her, the way she moved toward what she wanted without second-guessing the movement. She got in the truck and looked at his face. The bruise was almost entirely gone. By then a faint discoloration at the highest point of his cheekbone, barely visible in direct light. But Sophie was an observer of things, and she noticed it every time she looked at him. "It's almost gone," she said. "Almost," he agreed. "Did you ever tell me what it was from?" "A shelf," he said. "I told you that." She gave him the look. He drove. The first weeks of the new arrangement were not seamless. They weren't supposed to be. Gavin understood from the start that rebuilding a security infrastructure that had been compromised from the inside was a different kind of work from building one fresh, because you had to simultaneously construct something new and understand the old structure thoroughly enough to know where the weaknesses had been deliberately engineered rather than accidentally created. Warren Slade had been meticulous. The sophistication of what he'd built, the way it looked, on the surface, exactly like a well-designed security operation, while containing at its joints and connections the specific vulnerabilities that made it useful to the people paying him, required careful systematic analysis to fully map. Gavin spent the first 2 weeks doing almost nothing else, working through Warren's documentation with the concentrated attention of someone reading a text in a language they spoke fluently, but that had been written to mislead. He found 11 deliberate vulnerabilities, not accidental gaps. Deliberate ones, places where the protocol was designed to fail in specific circumstances, where the camera system would create blind spots under specific conditions, where the access logging would produce gaps that looked like system errors rather than intentional omissions. He documented all of them and brought the documentation to Vivienne. She read through it sitting at her desk with the same focused quiet she'd brought to Owen's envelope 3 weeks before the gala. When she finished, she set it down and was silent for a moment. 11, she said. "That I found," Gavin said. "I'm confident there are more in the external vendor contracts." He wrote the evaluation criteria for the vendors too, so the vendors themselves could be. "Some of them," he said. "Not all. We need to go through each contract individually." He paused. "That's a longer process. Weeks, not days." She looked at him. "How do you feel about that?" He looked back at her. "I feel like it needs to be done right." "Then we do it right," she said. Naomi Calder stayed on. That had been one of Gavin's early conversations with Vivienne, direct, specific, made in the first week, and Vivienne had agreed without argument because she'd been watching Naomi work for 3 years and had drawn her own conclusions about what Naomi was worth. Naomi's title changed. Her team expanded. She was given the operational authority that the previous structure had officially granted her, but that Warren's shadow management had consistently undermined. She and Gavin had a specific working relationship that took about 2 weeks to settle into its natural shape. She was better than him at institutional knowledge, the internal politics, the vendor histories, the personalities of the key people in Vivienne's orbit. He was better than her at seeing the structural vulnerabilities in systems that were designed to obscure them. They didn't overlap much, which was useful, and when they did overlap, they generally arrived at the same conclusions through different routes, which was reassuring. "You know what Warren's actual mistake was," Naomi said one afternoon, about 6 weeks into the rebuild. They were in the security monitoring suite on the 2nd floor, a room that had been completely rewired. New hardware, new software, new camera feeds from repositioned units going through vendor contract assessments. "Which one?" Gavin said. "His primary mistake." She looked at a document on her screen. "He built everything around the assumption that the vulnerability would never be found from the inside. He was very careful about external exposure. He managed the outside risk meticulously." She paused. "He never adequately accounted for the possibility that someone inside the organization would start looking." Gavin thought about Owen Voss, who had started looking 14 months before the gala and had spent 6 weeks in a motel piecing it together. "Owen," he said. "Owen noticed something small," Naomi said. "A discrepancy in a budget allocation for an external security audit. It was small enough that most people would have flagged it, gotten a plausible explanation, and moved on." Owen didn't move on. She paused. Warren had managed him for years. He underestimated him. That's what actually brought this down, not the gala, not that night. It was Owen noticing something small 3 months earlier. Gavin looked at the screen. He thought about that. About the way things ended, not in dramatic confrontations usually, but in small things that someone refused to let go. The thread you kept pulling until the whole structure came with it. "Document that," he said. "In the review. I want the final report to reflect how the detection actually happened. People need to understand that the finding wasn't lucky. It wasn't, Naomi agreed. It was Owen being Owen. Gavin thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about it on the drive home, and about what it said about the difference between systems and people, the way a well-designed system was only as reliable as the people inside it, but also the way a compromised system could be unwound by a single person who refused to accept a plausible explanation and kept asking questions that were inconvenient. He picked up Sophie from Mrs. Farrell's, where she'd been after school, and they drove home in the late afternoon light that came through the truck windows at that particular autumn angle that made everything look more specific and clear than it did at other times of year. "Dad," Sophie said, somewhere on Elmwood Street.
"Yeah."
"At school today we talked about jobs, like what jobs do things." She was looking out the passenger window. "Mrs. Alcott asked what our parents do, and I didn't know what to say." Gavin thought about this. "What did you say?" "I said you fix things," she said. "Is that right?" He drove for a moment. "That's pretty close," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She went back to looking out the window at the houses going by, and Gavin drove, and neither of them said anything else about it. But he turned it over in his mind for a long time afterward, the specificity of it, the accidental accuracy. "I said you fix things." The kitchen renovation and the porch step and the cab installation were one version of that. The work in the Sterling Crown that night was another version. The 11 vulnerabilities he'd mapped in Warren Slade's architecture and the vendor contracts he was going through, line by line, were a third version. They were all the same thing. At the core, the identification of what had gone wrong, the patient work of understanding how it had gone wrong, and the construction of something better in the space it left. He was, apparently, someone who fixed things. He'd been doing it long enough that it had become the organizing principle of how he moved through the world, without him ever making a conscious decision about it. Could have done worse. The criminal proceedings against the Meridian Vance principles moved through the legal system with the methodical slowness that criminal proceedings involving complex financial structures always moved, which meant months of discovery and document review and procedural maneuvering before anything resembling resolution. Gavin followed it at a distance enough to know the shape of it, not so close that it occupied more of his attention than it deserved. Warren Slade's cooperation was as comprehensive as he'd promised. His testimony mapped the full structure of the acquisition scheme, including 2 names at the top of the entity chain that the investigators had not previously connected to Meridian Vance. Those names, when they became part of the public record, turned out to be connected to 3 other ongoing investigations in different jurisdictions, which created a cascade effect that was still unwinding a year later. Warren himself was sentenced to 4 years, with a recommendation for early release contingent on continued cooperation. He served the sentence in a facility 3 states away. Gavin neither felt strongly about this outcome nor spent much time thinking about it. It was the justice system doing what it did imperfectly and at length, and the outcome was within the range of what was proportionate. That was about as much as he'd ever expected from it. North Haven broke ground 11 weeks after the gala, on a gray November morning with a small ceremony at the coastal site. Vivienne stood at a temporary podium with a hard hat. She looked slightly incongruous and said the things you said at a groundbreaking ceremony, the vision, the timeline, the investment in the region, the jobs the project would create. And Gavin stood at the edge of the gathered group and watched and thought about Owen Voss sitting in a motel room 40 minutes away while all of this was being prepared for. Construction, building his documentation package line by line. Owen was there that morning. He stood 3 people to Gavin's left and watched the ceremony with the expression of someone who understood what it represented in a way that wasn't visible from the podium. Afterward, he and Gavin stood together near the edge of the site where the coastal land opened out toward the water. "How are you doing?" Gavin said. "Better," Owen said. He said it like he meant it specifically rather than as a conversational reflex. "Sleep still isn't great, but better. It'll come back." "Yeah." Owen looked out at the water. The late November light was thin and flat, the kind of light that made distances look greater than they were. "I keep thinking about the timing of it. If I hadn't reached out to you when I did. If you'd shown up at the hotel an hour later." "You chose the timing," Gavin said. "You knew what you were doing." "I knew the rough shape of it," Owen said. "I didn't know if it would actually work." He paused. "I didn't have anyone else I trusted with it. It had to be you." Gavin looked at the water. "It worked," he said. Owen nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It worked." They stood there for a moment in the late November quiet, Two people who had served in different branches of a life that asked certain things of you and left certain marks. Watching a construction site that existed because someone had refused to let a small discrepancy go, and someone else had driven across the city on a Thursday night with a plain envelope and worn boots. It wasn't a dramatic conclusion. It didn't look like much from the outside. But Gavin had learned, over the course of a life that had now included more versions of this moment than he could easily count, that the things that mattered rarely looked like much from the outside. Thing that mattered was usually something quieter. Something you could only see if you were standing close enough and paying attention. Call from Vivienne that changed the texture of things, not the professional ones, but the other ones came on a Friday evening in early December. He was in the kitchen making dinner, which Sophie was theoretically helping with in the way that 7-year-olds helped with things which involved a great deal of proximity and commentary and approximately 10% of the actual work. "Are you doing anything Sunday?" Vivienne said. "You and Sophie, I mean. Both of you." Gavin looked at the calendar on the refrigerator. "Why?" A brief pause. "There's a thing at the Natural History Museum. A temporary exhibit." Another pause. "Deep-sea creatures." Gavin looked at Sophie, who was sitting on the counter beside the stove, despite the standing rule against sitting on the counter beside the stove, reading the label on the pasta box with the focused attention of someone who had run out of other things to read and was making do. "She's going to have opinions about that exhibit," he said. "I figured," Vivienne said. "I have opinions about exhibits, too. It seemed like we might have similar ones." He thought about what that invitation was and wasn't. He thought about the specific thing Vivienne Harrow was, as a person, direct, unsentimental, unwilling to say something she didn't mean, equally unwilling to not say something she did mean. He thought about the fact that she was suggesting a museum exhibit involving deep-sea creatures on a Sunday, which was not a professional meeting. He thought about what he'd said to her in the corridor of the Sterling Crown, about people who had something to protect, about the ones who had reasons. "Sophie," he said. She looked up from the pasta box. "How do you feel about the Natural History Museum on Sunday?" Her face went through the specific transition that happened when a 7-year-old was trying to determine if this was a trick question. Then she said, "Is the deep-sea exhibit still there?" Mia from school said it was there, but she might have meant last year. "It's there," Gavin said. Sophie's face completed its journey. "Yes," she said. It came out with the totality of someone for whom yes was the only appropriate answer to that question. Gavin put the phone back to his ear. "Sunday," he said. They went on Sunday. Vivienne met them at the museum entrance, and Gavin watched Sophie look at her, the same direct, assessing look she'd applied to his face 3 weeks ago, the same quality of observation that missed very little. Vivienne met it without flinching, which was, Gavin would reflect later, exactly the right thing to do. "You're the one from Dad's work," Sophie said. "I am," Vivienne said. "He said you run a company." "That's right," Sophie thought about this. "What kind of company?" "We build things," Vivienne said. "Mostly along the coast. Places for people to live and work." Sophie considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old receiving genuinely new information. "We went to the coast last summer," she said. "I found a sand dollar." "Did you keep it?" "It broke," Sophie said, on the way home. "But I have the pieces." Vivienne looked at her steadily. "That's still worth keeping," she said. Sophie appeared to agree, because she nodded once, and then turned toward the museum entrance and said, "The exhibit is on the 2nd floor. I read about it." They followed her. The deep-sea exhibit was everything Sophie had been hoping it would be: dark corridors lined with illuminated cases, bioluminescent displays, a central installation with an enormous tank populated with creatures that Gavin could not have named without Sophie's narration, which she provided continuously and without prompting for anyone in earshot. Vivienne walked beside her and asked questions, and Gavin walked behind them and watched. He had a specific feeling watching that, the kind of feeling that didn't have a clean word for itself. It was the feeling of seeing something that was not guaranteed and not simple become briefly real. Two people who had no prior claim on each other finding, in a conversation about transparent-headed fish and bioluminescent lures, something that neither of them had been expecting, and both of them recognized when it arrived. Sophie explained the barrel-eye fish to Vivienne with the same detail she'd explained it to Gavin 6 weeks ago, and Vivienne listened with the same full attention she brought to everything. And at the end, Sophie said, "Most people think eyes on the side of your head is the normal way, But actually lots of adaptations are possible, and normal is just what's common. Vivienne looked at her. Then she looked at Gavin. He looked back at her. She's right, Vivienne said. She usually is, he said. They had lunch in the museum cafe afterward. Sophie ate half a grilled cheese sandwich and talked about the anglerfish, and then pivoted, with no transition, the subject of the upcoming soccer playoff, which was apparently of equal scientific importance. Vivienne asked about the playoff with the same focused interest she'd brought to the fish, and Sophie, who was not easily impressed by adult attention, but was clearly recalibrating her position on this particular adult, accepted a question about her team's record and answered it in detail. Gavin ate his sandwich and watched his daughter explain soccer strategy to a billionaire CEO who was listening like it was the most interesting thing she'd heard all week, and felt the particular, quiet, unremarkable feeling of a life that was going in a direction he hadn't planned for and couldn't entirely explain and did not, in any way he could identify, want to stop. It wasn't a dramatic feeling. It didn't announce itself. It sat there, ordinary and solid the way the best things do. Over the months that followed, the change in things was gradual enough that it was hard to point to any single moment when it became what it became. There was a Tuesday evening when Vivienne stayed for dinner after a work conversation that had run long, and Sophie made her try the pasta recipe she'd been insisting was better than Gavin's, which it objectively wasn't. But Vivienne hated it and said it was excellent, which Sophie received as confirmation of a position she'd already held. There was a Saturday when Vivienne came to Sophie's soccer game and stood at the sideline in a coat that was not designed for standing in the November cold at a recreational youth soccer match, and watched the whole thing with the full attention she brought to everything, which Sophie pretended not to notice and visibly noticed anyway. There was a Sunday morning when Gavin came downstairs to find Sophie at the kitchen table with Vivienne's phone, listening to Vivienne explain something about how buildings were designed to stay up in wind, which had apparently started as a question about tornadoes. Sophie was in a weather phase now and had evolved into an impromptu structural engineering tutorial that Sophie was receiving with the focused seriousness she reserved for information she intended to retain. These moments didn't resolve into a single declaration. They accumulated, the way most real things accumulated, slowly, quietly, one ordinary instance at a time, until the accumulation was undeniable. By the following spring, Vivienne had a key to the house on Calloway Street, not because of any particular decision, but because she was there often enough that it had stopped making sense for her not to. By the following summer, the three of them drove to the coast, and Sophie found another sand dollar, and this time it didn't break, and she carried it the whole drive home in a small box Vivienne had produced from somewhere, padded with the tissue paper from inside a museum gift shop bag, and when they got home she put it on the shelf in her room, next to the deep-sea creatures book and the drawing of the possibly a horse from school. Gavin stood in the doorway of her room that evening and looked at the shelf. The sand dollar, the book, the drawing. The ordinary archaeology of a 7-year-old's life, arranged on a shelf in a house on Calloway Street, in a city that was continuing to do what cities did while the people inside them figured out what they were building. He thought about the man he'd been on a Thursday evening in November, walking through the Sterling Crown's marble lobby with an envelope under his arm and worn boots, and no plan beyond delivering the thing he'd been asked to deliver. He thought about what he'd expected from that night. Not much, honestly. He'd expected to hand over an envelope, say what needed to be said, and be home before 10. He had not expected any of what actually happened. But here was the thing about life that Gavin had arrived at. Slowly and without looking for it, the part that wasn't inspirational and wasn't a lesson and was just true. You didn't get to choose most of the things that mattered. You chose how to respond to them. You chose whether to walk through the door or stand outside it. You chose, in the specific moment that required choosing, which of your available selves was going to show up. He'd walked through the door. He'd kept walking through the doors. After that, the one in the loading bay corridor, the one into the staging area, the one into Vivienne's office on that Thursday morning, the museum entrance on that Sunday, all the ordinary doors of all the ordinary days that added up to something he hadn't named yet because he wasn't sure a name would fit it, but he knew what it was. Sophie came up behind him and leaned against his arm, looking at her shelf. The sand dollar is better than the pieces, she said. Most things are better whole, he said. She considered this with the seriousness she brought to propositions she was evaluating. Not always, she said. Sometimes you need to break something to understand what's inside it. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the dark brown eyes that had been assessing him since she was 3 years old and never found a reason to stop. "Where did you get that?" he said. "Vivienne said it," she said. "About buildings. That you have to understand the structure before you can fix it, and sometimes understanding the structure means taking it apart." Gavin looked at his daughter, who was 7 years old and had been listening to a structural engineering conversation with the absorbed attention of someone who was going to remember it, and thought about Vivienne, saying that, and about the specific truth of it, applied to every version of the thing it could apply to. "She's right," he said. "I know," Sophie said. She pushed off from his arm and headed back down the hallway toward the living room, where the sound of the television meant Vivienne was watching the nature documentary she'd been watching when Sophie had come to show her the shelf. "I'm going back," Sophie announced, as if this were a destination that required announcement. "Part about the deep ocean is starting." He heard her footsteps down the hallway. He heard the sound of the couch receiving another person. He heard, faintly, Sophie's voice beginning to explain something to Vivienne, and Vivienne's quieter response, and then Sophie's voice again. He stood in the doorway of Sophie's room and looked at the shelf for another moment. The sand dollar, the book, the drawing, the key on the hook by the front door, the second porch step that no longer creaked. He turned off Sophie's light and went down the hall toward the sound of his daughter's voice, toward the particular, unremarkable shape of an evening that was exactly what it looked like, and nothing more and nothing less, and was, in its ordinary completeness, everything. He had not gone looking for this. He had walked through a door with an envelope, and paid attention, and kept walking, and this was where the walking had brought him. It was, he thought, enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing.